My wife wanted an open marriage so she could pursue her boss while keeping me as backup. She thought she was so clever giving me permission to date knowing I'd probably strike out. But life loves a good plot twist. While she's stuck with a guy who won't even hold her hand in public, I found someone who can't wait to introduce me to her family. Her scheme backfired spectacularly and now I'm the happy one. Stay tuned to find out how her so-called manager romance blows up in her face. But let me start from the beginning because this story gets wild fast. What seemed like a solid marriage turned into the most obvious setup in relationship history. The setup when your wife suddenly discovers self-improvement. For 8 years, I thought my marriage was rock solid. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our quiet Sunday mornings where she'd steal half my coffee and I'd pretend to be annoyed. She was this homebody who preferred Netflix marathons to going out, who got anxious in large groups. I love that about her, actually. There was something comforting about being with someone who was perfectly content with our little bubble. Then she started this new job, and everything changed overnight. At first, I was genuinely excited for her. She'd been stuck in a boring office for years where nobody appreciated her ideas and her boss treated her like furniture. This new position came with better pay, cooler colleagues, and actual growth opportunities. When she told me about struggling to fit in with her new team, I encouraged her to put herself out there. Make friends, go to happy hour, be social. I figured it would boost her confidence and maybe she'd finally see herself the way I saw her. What I didn't expect was for her to transform into someone I barely recognized. Within weeks, my wife became this party animal who was out 3 nights a week doing team-building exercises that apparently required extensive amounts of alcohol. She started coming home at midnight smelling like expensive cocktails and talking about these amazing new friends who were teaching her how to live her best life. These women were mostly single, recently divorced or in complicated relationships, and they seemed to have convinced my wife that she'd been missing out on some grand adventure by being happily married. The bedroom situation became a disaster zone pretty quickly. My wife had never been the type to initiate intimacy, but now she was either too exhausted from her late nights or completely uninterested. When I tried to talk to her about the sudden changes, she'd brush me off and say she was just exploring who she really was. Apparently, who she really was turned out to be someone who had no time for her husband. Then came the manager. At first, it was innocent enough. She'd mentioned how this new guy was so different from previous bosses, how he really understood the team dynamics and made work fun again. But those casual mentions started happening every single day. She'd tell me about how he handled difficult clients with such finesse, how he resolved workplace conflicts beyond mere reports like some kind of corporate therapist, how he had this amazing ability to motivate everyone around him. These weren't work-related observations anymore. She was describing him like he was some kind of Renaissance man who happened to excel at quarterly reports. The warning bells in my head were going off, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was just excited about having a boss who wasn't terrible for once. But then came the questions that made everything crystal clear. She started asking if I ever regretted not dating more women before we got together. Did I ever wonder what it would be like to be with someone else? Did I feel like I missed out on experiences by settling down so young? I kept telling her no, that she was everything I wanted and needed, but she'd get this weird look in her eyes like my answer disappointed her somehow. She'd quickly changed the subject, but I could tell these conversations were leading somewhere specific. The way she asked made it obvious she already had someone in mind for her own exploration. Her crush on this manager was becoming more transparent by the day. She started talking about him in contexts that had nothing to do with work. How he handled stress, his philosophy on work-life balance, his thoughts on relationships and personal growth. She knew details about his personal life that seemed way too intimate for a professional relationship. She'd light up when his name came up in conversation, the same way teenagers get excited talking about their favorite celebrity, The woman who used to get embarrassed making eye contact with waiters was practically glowing every time she mentioned this guy. I started paying closer attention to her stories about work events and noticed how they all seemed to revolve around interactions with him. The team building exercises always involved him organizing activities. The late nights were strategy sessions where he was sharing his wisdom about life and career advancement. The group drinks somehow always ended up being deep conversations where he was offering personal advice to everyone. Either this guy was running some kind of workplace therapy practice, or my wife was finding excuses to spend as much time with him as possible. The most ridiculous part was how she thought she was being subtle about the whole thing. She'd casually work his name into completely unrelated conversations. We'd be watching a movie and she'd comment on how the main character handled conflict just like her manager would. We'd be at dinner and she'd mention how he'd recommended this great restaurant across town. She was like a teenager with her first crush, finding ways to bring up her obsession in every conversation while thinking nobody noticed. Meanwhile, she kept dropping hints about feeling like she'd missed out on life experiences by getting married so young. She'd see couples on dating shows and wonder out loud what it would be like to have that excitement of meeting someone new. She'd ask hypothetical questions about whether people could love multiple people at the same time. Every conversation felt like she was testing the waters for something bigger. I could see the wheels turning in her head during these discussions. She was clearly working up to some grand proposal, but trying to make it seem like a natural evolution of our relationship rather than a scheme she'd been cooking up since the day she met this guy. The timing was so obvious it was almost insulting. Within months of meeting this manager, she'd gone from contentedly married homebody to someone questioning the entire foundation of monogamous relationships. Her friends were obviously encouraging this whole transformation. These single and divorced women had convinced her that she was wasting her life being faithful to one person. They were filling her head with stories about all the amazing experiences she was missing out on, all the personal growth that could only come from dating multiple people, all the adventure waiting for her if she just had the courage to explore. The funniest part was watching her think she was being so clever about the whole setup. She probably practiced these conversations in the mirror, rehearsing how to bring up the topic of relationship flexibility without making it obvious she already had a specific person in mind. She thought she was being this smooth manipulator when really she was as transparent as glass. Could her push for self-improvement lead to real trouble? What happened next would prove just how wrong she was about everything. The pitch, how to cheat without technically cheating. Then came the conversation that changed everything. After weeks of building up to this moment, she finally revealed her master plan. We were sitting on the couch after dinner when she brought up the topic of open marriage like she was suggesting we try a new restaurant. She said she'd been thinking about how we could spice up our relationship and add some excitement to our lives. The timing was perfect, considering she'd spent the last hour telling me about another fascinating conversation she'd had with her manager about life philosophy and personal growth. Her pitch was honestly impressive in its audacity. She explained how we could explore connections with other people while still maintaining our strong foundation together. We'd have the security of our marriage, but also the freedom to experience what we might be missing. She painted this picture of how much stronger our relationship would become once we satisfied our curiosity about other people. It was the ultimate solution that would let her have her cake and eat it too. I sat there stunned because this was coming from the woman who used to get jealous when female cashiers smiled at me too long. The same person who once got upset because I mentioned finding an actress attractive during a movie. She transformed from someone who wanted complete devotion to someone suggesting we share ourselves with strangers. It was like my traditional homebody wife had been replaced by someone who'd been reading too many relationship blogs written by people with commitment issues. The way she presented it made it sound so reasonable and modern. She talked about how some couples were exploring these arrangements and how it could actually strengthen our bond by removing the pressure and expectations that come with monogamy. She said we were mature enough to handle this kind of relationship evolution and that it showed how much we trusted each other. Her argument was so well rehearsed it was obvious she'd been practicing this speech for weeks. The timing of this proposal was about as subtle as a marching band at a funeral. Just days after telling me about another deep, meaningful conversation with her manager, she was suddenly interested in opening our marriage. The woman who'd never shown any interest in relationship experimentation was now advocating for the exact arrangement that would give her permission to pursue the guy she'd been obsessing over for months. She might as well have handed me a written request to approve her affair. She kept emphasizing how this wasn't about anyone specific, but about personal growth and exploration. We were young when we got together, and maybe we'd benefit from understanding what else was out there. She said it would make us appreciate each other more once we realized how good we had it together. The whole presentation felt like she was trying to convince me to invest in something I knew would bankrupt me emotionally. My brain was spinning, trying to process this complete personality change. This was the woman who used to say she couldn't imagine being with anyone else, who would get sentimental about her wedding vows, who said she felt sorry for people who couldn't find their soulmate like she had. Now she was sitting here explaining why limiting ourselves to one person was actually holding us back from reaching our full potential as individuals and as a couple. She addressed my obvious shock by saying she knew this seemed sudden, but she'd been thinking about it for a long time. She wanted to be honest about her feelings rather than let resentment build up over missed opportunities. She said she loved me too much to cheat, but also felt like she was dying inside from wondering what else might be out there. This arrangement would let her explore without betraying our marriage or losing what we'd built together. The manipulation was almost artistic in its execution. She positioned herself as the honest wife who was being transparent about her needs rather than going behind my back. She made it seem like opening the marriage was actually the more ethical choice compared to having an affair. She was basically asking for a hall pass while making it sound like she was doing me a favor by being upfront while wanting to sleep with other people. I found myself caught between my gut instinct that this was completely wrong and not wanting to seem like some controlling husband who couldn't handle his wife's personal growth. She'd framed the whole thing in a way that made any objection sound possessive and outdated. If I said no, I'd be the jealous husband holding her back from self-discovery. If I agreed, I'd be the understanding partner who trusted her enough to explore this together. She kept asking what I thought about the idea, and whether I might be interested in exploring connections with other women too. The way she asked made it clear she expected me to be excited about this opportunity. She probably assumed I'd jump at the chance to date other people since most guys would supposedly love that kind of arrangement. She seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't immediately on board with her brilliant plan. The pressure to agree was intense because she presented it as this mature, evolved approach to relationships that only confident couples could handle. Saying no would mean admitting I was too insecure or traditional to embrace this kind of modern relationship structure. She'd already decided this was happening and was just going through the motions of getting my consent to make it seem like a mutual decision. I kept thinking about how our parents and grandparents never had to navigate these kinds of relationship negotiations. They got married and stayed faithful until death do us part without having to consider whether they were missing out on other experiences. Now apparently commitment was seen as limiting rather than meaningful. Somewhere along the way, society decided that exploring multiple relationships was more important than building depth with one person. The whole conversation felt surreal because I knew I was being manipulated, but couldn't find a way to say no without looking like the bad guy. She constructed this perfect scenario where agreeing made me the understanding husband and refusing made me the controlling one. There was no option that let me express how wrong this felt without seeming unreasonable or possessive. After hours of discussion and her patient explanations about why this would ultimately benefit both of us, I finally agreed. I told her we could try it, but with clear rules and honest communication about how we were both feeling. Even as the words came out of my mouth, I knew I was making a huge mistake. I was essentially giving my wife official permission to pursue the relationship she'd already been building with her manager. She was so relieved when I said yes that it confirmed my suspicions about her true motivations. This wasn't about spicing up our marriage or personal growth. This was about getting approval for something she planned to do regardless of my feelings. I just made it easier for her by removing the guilt and secrecy from her upcoming affair. She'd managed to turn cheating into an approved marital activity, and I'd gone along with it because I didn't want to seem like the unreasonable one. What I didn't realize was just how differently this arrangement would play out for each of us. Game on, the tale of two dating experiences. The dating apps went live and immediately revealed just how unprepared we both were for what came next. My wife jumped into this new world like she'd been training for months, while I sat there wondering what the hell I got myself into. She had profiles on 3 different apps within 24 hours and was getting matches faster than I could process what was happening to my life. The speed at which she moved should have been my first clue that this whole arrangement had been planned long before our conversation on the couch. She knew exactly what photos to use, exactly how to write her profile, and exactly what she was looking for. Meanwhile, I stared at a blank dating profile for 3 days trying to figure out how to explain that I was married but available without sounding like either a creep or a guy having a midlife crisis. She went on her first date within a week and came home glowing like she'd just discovered electricity. She told me all about this amazing dinner conversation and how refreshing it was to connect with someone new. The guy was charming and funny and made her feel things she'd forgotten she could feel. She asked if I was okay with everything and seemed genuinely concerned about my feelings right up until I started talking. Then her eyes would glaze over and she'd start checking her phone for messages from her new friend. My first attempt at dating was a disaster that lasted exactly 1 drink. I met this woman at a coffee shop and spent the entire hour feeling like I was cheating on my wife even though I had explicit permission to be there. Every time the conversation turned flirty, I'd panic and redirect to safe topics like the weather or current events. She probably thought I was the most boring person she'd ever met. I went home that night feeling guilty and confused, while my wife was out on her second date of the week. The predictable part was watching her gravitate straight toward her manager like a moth to a flame. She'd mentioned casually that she'd run into him while out with friends or that they grabbed coffee to discuss work projects. These workplace encounters started happening with suspicious frequency. Soon she was telling me about their deep conversations about life goals and personal philosophy. The woman who'd sold me on exploring connections with strangers was spending all her time with the one person she'd been obsessing over for months. My dating app experience was like trying to learn a foreign language while everyone else was having fluent conversations. Women would message me with references to memes I didn't understand or expect me to know the unwritten rules of modern dating etiquette. I'd spend 20 minutes crafting responses that sounded normal only to get one-word replies or complete silence. Apparently, 8 years of marriage had left me completely unprepared for whatever this new dating world had become. She started staying out later and coming home with stories about amazing restaurants and fun bars I'd never heard of. Her social calendar became packed with dates and group hangouts while I was struggling to get through one awkward coffee meeting per week. She'd ask how my dating was going with this tone of voice that suggested she expected me to be having as much fun as she was. When I told her about my struggles, she'd offer helpful advice about being more confident and putting myself out there. The irony was suffocating. The person who'd wanted this arrangement was thriving while I felt like I was drowning in experiences I never asked for. She'd wake up energized and excited about her plans for the evening while I dreaded having to pretend I was enjoying this new lifestyle. She was living her best life while I was questioning everything I thought I knew about love and commitment. Her fake concern for my well-being became more obvious as the weeks went by. She'd check in with me about how I was handling everything, but it felt like going through the motions rather than genuine interest. If I mentioned feeling uncomfortable or confused, she'd remind me that we'd agreed to try this together and that it would take time to adjust. She never offered to slow down or reconsider the arrangement. She just wanted confirmation that I wasn't going to ruin her fun by having feelings about it. Dating apps revealed just how out of practice I was with the whole concept of romantic pursuit. I'd forgotten how to flirt without feeling ridiculous or how to show interest without coming across as desperate. Women my age were either looking for serious relationships that I couldn't offer as a married man or casual hookups that felt wrong given my traditional values. I was stuck in this weird middle ground where I wasn't single enough for the dating world, but wasn't married enough to feel secure in my relationship. She started bringing up her manager more frequently in our conversations about her dating experiences. They'd moved from occasional coffee meetings to regular dinner dates to weekend activities together. She described their chemistry and emotional connection like she was talking about characters in a romantic movie. The woman who'd promised this was about exploring multiple connections was clearly focusing all her energy on one specific person. My attempts at physical intimacy with other women felt like betraying everything I believed about love and commitment. Even when opportunities presented themselves, I'd find excuses to leave early or redirect conversations away from anything too personal. I was participating in an open marriage while still thinking like a monogamous person. The cognitive dissonance was tearing me apart. She'd return from her dates with stories about meaningful conversations and exciting adventures while I came home from mine feeling empty and confused. She was discovering new sides of herself through these connections while I was losing pieces of who I thought I was. The arrangement that was supposed to strengthen our relationship was highlighting just how differently we approached love and loyalty. Her enthusiasm for this lifestyle made it clear that she'd been feeling trapped in our marriage long before she suggested opening it. She was finally getting to be the person she'd always wanted to be while I was being forced to become someone I never wanted to become. The gap between our experiences was growing wider every day, and I was starting to wonder if this whole experiment was going to destroy everything we built together. After months of awkward encounters and failed connections, I was ready to give up on this whole dating thing entirely. But sometimes life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Plot twist: when the underdog finds his match. That surprise came in the form of Sarah. After months of awkward coffee dates and uncomfortable small talk, I finally connected with someone who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person rather than treating our meeting like some kind of social experiment. She was this vibrant woman who had moved here from South America for work and brought this refreshing perspective on life that I hadn't encountered in years. What struck me immediately was how easy conversation felt with her. We talked for hours about everything from travel stories to career goals to family traditions without any of those painful silences that had plagued my other dating attempts. She laughed at my jokes and asked follow-up questions about my interests like she actually cared about the answers. For the first time since this whole open marriage experiment began, I found myself looking forward to spending time with someone instead of dreading another evening of forced interaction. The difference between being with Sarah and being in my marriage became crystal clear within weeks. She would text me during the day just to share something funny that happened or ask how my work presentation went. She remembered details from our previous conversations and brought up topics she knew I was passionate about. When we were together, she gave me her full attention instead of constantly checking her phone or seeming distracted by other thoughts. It was like discovering what genuine interest and affection felt like after years of taking scraps for granted. My wife's reaction to this development was hilarious in its complete miscalculation. When I mentioned that I'd been seeing someone regularly, she smiled and nodded like this was exactly what she'd hoped would happen. She asked basic questions about Sarah, with the same tone she might use to inquire about a new hobby I picked up. She seemed relieved that I was finally participating in the arrangement properly instead of moping around about how uncomfortable everything made me feel. She had no idea that what was developing between Sarah and me was fundamentally different from her casual dating adventures. While my wife was collecting experiences and enjoying the thrill of variety, I was building something real with someone who actually wanted to build something back. Sarah wasn't interested in playing games or keeping things casual. She wanted to know about my life, my dreams, my fears, and my plans for the future in ways that my own wife hadn't bothered to ask in years. The speed at which genuine connection can develop when both people are actually invested became obvious within the first month. Sarah and I moved from casual dates to spending entire weekends together, talking about everything and nothing. She introduced me to her friends who welcomed me like I belonged there instead of treating me like some married guy they had to tolerate. Her enthusiasm for spending time with me was infectious and reminded me what it felt like to be genuinely wanted, rather than simply tolerated. The irony was perfect. While my wife was busy playing elaborate games with her manager who treated her like an entertaining distraction between meetings, I had stumbled into something authentic with someone who saw me as worth her time and attention. She was chasing workplace fantasy while I was experiencing real emotional intimacy for the first time in years. Her carefully orchestrated plan was succeeding in ways she never intended. Sarah's approach to our relationship highlighted everything that had been missing from my marriage. She would suggest activities we could do together and get excited about planning future adventures. She talked about introducing me to her family back home and asked about meeting mine. She treated our relationship like something worth investing in rather than something to be managed around other priorities. The contrast with my wife's emotional unavailability was striking. My confidence started returning in ways I hadn't expected. Sarah's genuine appreciation for who I was as a person made me remember qualities about myself that I'd forgotten existed. She would compliment my sense of humor, my thoughtfulness, my ability to listen, and my perspective on various topics. Having someone actually notice and value these traits after years of feeling invisible in my own marriage was transformative. I started carrying myself differently and feeling like I had something worthwhile to offer. The shift in power dynamics at home became impossible to ignore. I was no longer the desperate husband waiting around for scraps of attention from his wife. I had somewhere else to be and someone else who was excited to see me. When my wife would cancel our plans or come home late from her dates, I would make my own plans with Sarah instead of sitting around feeling sorry for myself. My newfound independence clearly caught my wife off guard. She started noticing that I wasn't as available for her emotional needs as I used to be. When she wanted to talk about her dating experiences or process her feelings about the open marriage, I had my own relationship to focus on instead of being her unpaid therapist. I was no longer the reliable emotional support system she'd taken for granted while she explored connections with other people. The dynamic had shifted, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. My enthusiasm for time with Sarah contrasted sharply with my growing indifference toward my wife's stories about her romantic adventures. She would try to share details about her dates with the manager, and I would listen politely, but without the engagement she was used to getting from me. I had my own relationship to think about, and frankly, her experiences with someone who wouldn't even acknowledge her publicly weren't that interesting compared to being with someone who was proud to be seen with me. Sarah's eagerness to integrate me into her life stood in stark contrast to my wife's manager, who seemed content to keep their relationship confined to secret dinners and private text conversations. While my wife was getting the thrill of forbidden romance, I was experiencing the satisfaction of being with someone who actually wanted to build a future together. She was settling for scraps while I was being offered the whole meal. The tables had completely turned from where we started this experiment. My wife had assumed she would be the successful one who found fulfillment through multiple connections while I struggled with the emotional complexity of non-monogamy. Instead, she was dealing with the complications of workplace romance and keeping secrets while I had found someone who brought joy and stability to my life. Her perfect plan was creating the exact opposite results from what she'd intended, and watching her slowly realize when reality hits like a freight train, entertaining part of the whole The shift in her behavior was immediate and obvious. She went from barely noticing my existence to studying my every move like I was some kind of fascinating science experiment. Suddenly, she was asking detailed questions about my plans for the evening and showing concern about whether I was getting enough sleep. The woman who had been too busy with her own romantic adventures to remember our anniversary was now tracking my schedule like a private investigator. Her first attempt at damage control was transforming into this domestic goddess overnight. I came home one evening to find her in the kitchen wearing an apron I didn't even know we owned, preparing some elaborate 3-course meal she'd apparently spent all day planning. She had candles lit, music playing, and this forced smile that screamed desperation. This was the same woman who had been living off takeout and microwave dinners for months because she was too busy with her dating life to cook anything that required more than 3 minutes of preparation. The surprise visits to my workplace started happening with suspicious frequency. She would show up with coffee and homemade cookies, claiming she was in the neighborhood and thought I might want a treat. My coworkers were confused because she had never done anything like this during our entire marriage. She would linger around my desk making small talk and asking about my projects with this intense interest that felt completely manufactured. She was performing the role of devoted wife for an audience that could sense something was off about the whole production. Her gift-giving became almost aggressive in its persistence. I would find little presents on my pillow, thoughtful notes in my lunch, and surprise deliveries of things I had mentioned wanting months earlier. She was suddenly paying attention to every casual comment I made about needing new headphones or wanting to try that restaurant across town. The woman who used to forget my birthday was now celebrating random Tuesday afternoons like they were national holidays. The irony was crushing because these were all gestures that would have meant the world to me 6 months earlier. Back when I was desperately trying to connect with her and feeling invisible in our marriage, any one of these romantic efforts would have convinced me that we could work through our problems. Now they felt hollow and calculated, like watching someone follow a relationship advice manual they'd found online. She was finally giving me everything I had begged for when I no longer wanted it from her. Her attempts to compete with Sarah were painful to witness. She would ask leading questions about what we did together and then immediately suggest we should try similar activities. If I mentioned that Sarah and I had gone hiking, she would suddenly develop an interest in outdoor adventures. When I told her about the cooking class Sarah had signed us up for, she started researching culinary workshops we could attend together. She was trying to copy homework from someone who was actually passing the class. The timing of her romantic awakening was so transparent it was almost insulting. She had spent months treating our marriage like an inconvenient obligation while she pursued her workplace fantasy. Now that I had found someone who actually wanted to spend time with me, she was suddenly remembering all the ways to be a caring partner. She was like a student who ignored assignments all semester and then showed up asking for extra credit the day before final exams. Her panic became more obvious as weeks passed and her efforts failed to generate the response she expected. She would plan these elaborate date nights complete with reservations at expensive restaurants and tickets to shows I had mentioned wanting to see. When I would politely decline because I already had plans with Sarah, she would get this look of confusion like she couldn't understand why her perfect evening wasn't working its magic. She had apparently assumed that grand gestures would automatically reset our relationship dynamics. Her friends started getting involved in ways that made the whole situation even more ridiculous. They would conveniently run into me at coffee shops and restaurants to tell me how much my wife missed spending time with me. They would share stories about how she talked about me constantly and worried that she had made mistakes and how she handled our relationship. These women who had encouraged her to explore other options were now trying to convince me that she had learned from her experiences and was ready to recommit to our marriage. The physical affection attempts were the most awkward part of her campaign. She would try to cuddle while we watched television or reach for my hand during dinner like we were teenagers on a first date. She started initiating intimate moments with this forced enthusiasm that felt like she was checking items off a list rather than expressing genuine desire. The woman who had been too tired or distracted for physical connection for months was suddenly acting like we were on our honeymoon. The most revealing moment came when she sat me down for what she clearly thought would be a relationship-saving conversation. She told me how much our marriage meant to her and how she had realized through her dating experiences that what we had was special and worth fighting for. She said she was ready to close the marriage and focus entirely on rebuilding what we had together. She delivered this speech with such conviction that I could tell she had rehearsed it multiple times in preparation for this moment. When she finished her heartfelt monologue and looked at me expectantly waiting for my emotional response, I started laughing. Not a cruel laugh, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of the situation. Here was the woman who had orchestrated this entire arrangement so she could pursue her manager, now trying to convince me that she had discovered the value of commitment through exploring other relationships. She looked shocked that her performance hadn't moved me to tears of gratitude. Her face, when I laughed, was worth everything I had endured over the past year. She had clearly expected me to be overcome with relief that she was choosing our marriage over her other options. Instead, I was amused by her assumption that I would be grateful she had decided I was worth keeping after testing out the alternatives. She had completely miscalculated how much damage her experiment had done and how little interest I had in being her consolation prize. What she didn't realize was that while she was busy trying to win me back with her desperate housewife routine, her perfect workplace romance was about to fall apart in ways she never saw coming. The Great Awakening, when the manager shows his true colors. The manager's true nature revealed itself during what should have been just another routine coffee break. She was walking back from the bathroom when she heard his voice coming from the break room, talking to another colleague about weekend plans. She probably expected to overhear him mentioning their upcoming dinner date or expressing how much he enjoyed spending time with her. Instead, she got to listen to him describe her as the easiest conquest he had ever made at work. He told his colleague that married women were perfect because they wanted excitement without commitment and never expected anything serious to develop. He laughed about how she hung on his every word during their conversations and how obvious it was that she would do anything to keep his attention. He said she was convenient entertainment between meetings, but nothing he would ever consider taking seriously. The casual cruelty of his assessment was breathtaking in its accuracy. He described exactly what their relationship actually was from his perspective, while she had been living in some romantic fantasy where workplace attraction leads to meaningful connection. He talked about her like she was a hobby he picked up to pass time, rather than a person he cared about. The man she had been describing to me as her soulmate saw her as a distraction that required minimal effort to maintain. Her horror at overhearing this conversation was probably matched only by the realization that she had been incredibly naive about his intentions from the very beginning. Every meaningful conversation she had treasured was just him being polite to a colleague who was making his workdays more interesting. Every romantic gesture she had interpreted as evidence of their special connection was actually just basic human decency from someone who knew she would read more into it than he intended. The comedy of workplace affairs is that they follow the same predictable script every single time, but people convince themselves their situation is different. The married person thinks they have found their true love, while the other person sees an easy arrangement with someone who cannot make demands or cause complications. Office romances rarely end with anyone leaving their spouse for the coworker who keeps snacks in their desk drawer and knows way too much about quarterly reports. Her carefully constructed fantasy started crumbling faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. All those deep conversations about life philosophy and personal growth that she had thought were evidence of their intellectual connection were actually just him making small talk with someone who was clearly desperate for his attention. The weekend activities she had interpreted as romantic dates were probably just him being friendly to a colleague who happened to be available when he was bored. The real punch to the gut came when his colleague asked about his upcoming engagement party and whether he was nervous about getting married. My wife got to discover that her workplace Prince Charming had been planning his wedding to someone else. The entire time she was throwing away her marriage for him. She was not even the other woman in this scenario. She was the other woman to the other woman who did not even know she existed. Learning that he was engaged explained so much about his behavior that should have been obvious red flags from the beginning. The reason he never wanted to be seen together outside of work was not because he was being discreet about office relationships. He was avoiding being spotted by anyone who might know his actual girlfriend. The reason their dates always happened at restaurants across town was not because he was romantic, but because he was hiding her from people in his real life. The devastating comparison between her situation and mine became crystal clear in that moment. While she was settling for being someone's secret lunch break entertainment, I was with someone who wanted to introduce me to her family. She had been fighting for scraps from someone who saw her as a convenience while I was being treated like a priority by someone who actually valued my time and attention. Her brilliant plan had given her exactly what she deserved. The emotional breakdown that followed was apparently spectacular enough to become office gossip for weeks. She ran to the parking garage and had a complete meltdown that included hyperventilating, crying, and vomiting behind a dumpster like some tragic character from a soap opera. The woman who had been floating on cloud nine for months discovered that her entire romantic fantasy was built on wishful thinking and desperate interpretation of basic social interactions. Her colleagues probably knew exactly what was happening because workplace affairs are never as secret as the participants think they are. Everyone could see that she was infatuated with the manager and that he was just being polite to someone who clearly had a crush on him. They watched her light up every time he walked into a room and probably felt secondhand embarrassment at how obvious her feelings were compared to his complete indifference. The speed at which workplace romance loses its appeal when you realize you are just entertainment is remarkable. One minute she was living her best life with this exciting new relationship, and the next she was facing the reality that she had destroyed her marriage for someone who would forget her name within a week of finding a new job. She went from feeling like the star of her own romantic movie to realizing she was actually the punchline of an office joke. The irony of discovering that she had been the other woman all along while lecturing me about exploring connections and personal growth was perfect cosmic justice. She had convinced herself that opening our marriage was about honest communication and emotional authenticity while secretly planning an affair with someone who was lying to her about his entire relationship status. Her moral high ground turned out to be built on quicksand. The manager went back to his regular routine of being professionally polite while planning his wedding to someone who actually mattered to him. My wife went back to a job where everyone knew she had made a fool of herself over someone who never saw her as anything more than a temporary diversion. Her perfect plan had turned into a complete disaster, and everyone could see it except the person who had been too blinded by fantasy to notice reality. Coming home that night, she looked like someone who had been hit by a truck and then backed over for good measure. The confident woman who had been lecturing me about personal growth and relationship evolution was gone. In her place was someone who clearly needed to figure out how to salvage whatever was left of the life she had systematically destroyed. The panic in her eyes told me she was finally ready to face some uncomfortable truths about the choices she had made. Damage control, the desperate campaign to save face. Her response was launching the most desperate damage control campaign I had ever witnessed. Once she realized that her workplace fantasy had crumbled and her husband was no longer waiting around like a loyal dog, she went into full panic mode. The woman who had been confident enough to orchestrate an entire open marriage arrangement suddenly became this desperate person trying to undo months of calculated destruction with apologies and promises she should have made a year earlier. Her first move was demanding that we close our marriage immediately. She sat me down with this serious expression and explained that she had learned so much about herself through this experience and now understood what really mattered. She said she wanted to focus entirely on rebuilding our relationship and putting our marriage first. The timing was perfect considering her manager had just revealed that she meant nothing to him while I was planning weekend getaways with someone who actually cared about my existence. The confession that followed was like watching someone admit to planning a bank robbery while trying to convince you they were just window shopping. She finally acknowledged that she had been having an emotional affair with her manager before we opened our marriage. She said they had been texting and meeting for coffee and having deep conversations about their feelings. She claimed this was not technically cheating because they never did anything physical beyond what she called mutual self-pleasure during their text conversations. Her legal loophole defense was amazing in its creativity. She explained that since they never actually touched each other in person, their relationship existed in some gray area between friendship and infidelity. The texting was just communication. The private meetings were just colleagues getting to know each other. The sexual tension was just natural chemistry between two people who understood each other. She had convinced herself that cheating required physical contact and everything else was just emotional exploration. The therapy session she insisted we attend became a comedy show I will never forget. She had booked us an emergency appointment with a marriage counselor who specialized in couples recovering from infidelity. My wife spent the first 20 minutes explaining our open marriage experiment while the therapist nodded and took notes. Then she launched into her confession about the manager and completely fell apart like a toddler having a meltdown in the middle of a grocery store. The hyperventilation started when she tried to explain how she had never meant for things to go so far with him. She was gasping for air between words while tears and snot streamed down her face. The therapist had to get her a box of tissues and a glass of water while she tried to compose herself enough to continue speaking. She kept apologizing between sobs and saying she just wanted to fix everything and go back to the way things used to be. Watching her get on her knees begging for forgiveness was surreal because this was someone I had thought was safely tucked away as my backup plan while she explored other options. She was literally on the floor of our living room holding onto my legs and promising she would do anything to make our marriage work. She said she would quit her job, cut off all contact with her manager, delete her dating profiles, and dedicate herself entirely to rebuilding my trust in her. My emotional detachment during her breakdown surprised both of us. I stood there watching her fall apart and felt nothing but mild curiosity about how long this performance would continue. The woman who had been the center of my world for 8 years was having a complete meltdown at my feet, and I was thinking about what time I needed to leave to meet Sarah for dinner. The love I had felt for her was so completely gone that even her genuine desperation could not generate any sympathy. Her suggestion that we move away and start fresh somewhere new was the ultimate solution for someone who had created an unsolvable problem. She wanted us to pack up our lives and relocate to a different city where nobody knew about our open marriage experiment or her affair with her manager. She painted this picture of how we could reinvent ourselves and rebuild our relationship without the baggage of everything that had happened. She was basically proposing witness relocation for cheaters. The irony of her finally being completely honest was that it came only after she had been caught and abandoned by the person she thought she wanted. She was not confessing because she felt guilty about deceiving me. She was confessing because her backup plan had failed and she needed to secure her primary relationship before she ended up with nothing. Her honesty was motivated by fear rather than genuine remorse. Her attempts to negotiate terms for saving our marriage were desperate and pathetic. She offered to give me access to all her social media accounts, her phone, and her email. She said I could check her location whenever I wanted, and she would never go anywhere without telling me exactly where she was going and who she would be with. She was volunteering for a level of surveillance that would have insulted her 6 months earlier when she was demanding freedom to explore her connections. The moment that crystallized everything came when she asked what she needed to do to compete with Sarah for my affection. She wanted to know what Sarah provided that she could not offer. She was ready to transform herself into whatever version of a wife I wanted as long as I would stop seeing my girlfriend and recommit to our marriage. She was offering to become a completely different person to win back someone she had systematically destroyed her relationship with. My response was probably the most devastating thing I could have said to her. I explained calmly that closing our marriage would not be fair to Sarah, who had done nothing wrong and deserved better than being abandoned because my wife had finally realized the consequences of her actions. I told her that Sarah treated me with respect and kindness, and I was not going to hurt someone who cared about me to make my wife feel better about her choices. The power dynamic had completely reversed from where we started this experiment. She was now the one begging for attention and commitment, while I was the one with options and independence. She had assumed I would always be available as her safety net while she explored other relationships. Instead, I had found someone who made me happy, and she was facing the possibility of losing the backup plan she had taken for granted. Her final desperate act was clinging to me physically while I packed clothes to stay at Sarah's place for the weekend. She wrapped her arms around my waist and refused to let go while promising she would change and be the wife I deserved. She was treating me like a life raft in the ocean of consequences she had created for herself. The woman who had been too busy with her dating life to notice my existence was now terrified of being left alone with the results of her brilliant plan. What made her situation even more entertaining was watching the same chaos spread to everyone who had encouraged this disaster in the first place. The friend group fallout when bad advice comes home to roost. The beautiful irony of toxic friend groups is watching them destroy each other with the same terrible advice they handed out so confidently. My wife's circle of relationship experts was about to experience their own dose of karma as their brilliant strategies backfired on every single one of them. These women who had convinced her that opening our marriage was the path to personal fulfillment were discovering that their own wisdom was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. The first domino to fall was Jessica, the divorced friend who had been the loudest advocate for exploring other options. She had been telling my wife for months that monogamy was an outdated concept and that modern women deserved to experience everything life had to offer. Jessica was the one who suggested that workplace attractions were natural and should be pursued rather than suppressed. She painted this picture of liberation and self-discovery that made my wife feel foolish for being satisfied with just one relationship. Jessica decided to follow her own advice and started pursuing her own manager at a different company. She used the exact same playbook that my wife had attempted, starting with innocent coffee meetings and building up to deeper conversations about life goals and personal philosophy. She convinced herself that this older, successful man was genuinely interested in her insights and perspectives rather than just being polite to an employee who was clearly infatuated with him. The pregnancy scare that followed was comedy gold in its predictability. Jessica discovered that workplace managers apparently had a type, and that type was married women who worked in their professional circle. This guy was running the same game on multiple women across different companies like some kind of corporate player with a systematic approach to workplace conquest. Jessica found herself in the exact same position my wife had been in. believing she was special while actually being just another Tuesday afternoon distraction. Her boyfriend Mark discovered the affair when Jessica forgot to log out of her email on their shared computer. He found months of intimate correspondence with her manager, including explicit photos and detailed plans for secret meetings. The digital age version of finding lipstick on a collar, except infinitely more devastating because email preserves everything in excruciating detail. Mark got to read exactly what his girlfriend thought about him compared to her exciting new romance. The manager's reaction to Jessica's pregnancy announcement revealed his true character faster than a DNA test. This man, who had been whispering sweet promises about their special connection, suddenly became very concerned about women who might be trying to trap him with unexpected responsibilities. He accused her of planning the whole thing to force him into leaving his wife and suggested she was manipulating the situation for financial gain. The romantic fantasy collapsed into ugly accusations and legal threats within hours. Jessica's relationship imploded exactly the way my wife's had, except faster and messier. Mark threw her belongings on the front lawn and changed the locks while she was at work. Her manager stopped returning her calls and started avoiding her at the office. She went from having 2 men interested in her to having nobody who wanted anything to do with her. The exploration that was supposed to lead to personal growth instead led to complete social isolation. The chain reaction continued with Lisa, another friend who had encouraged my wife to pursue her manager while keeping me as a backup option. Lisa decided that her own marriage had become too routine and started looking for excitement outside her relationship. She joined dating apps while married and began meeting men for drinks and dinner dates that she convinced herself were just friendly conversations with interesting people. Lisa's husband discovered her activities when their credit card statement showed charges at restaurants and hotels she had never mentioned visiting. The paper trail of her exploration told a story that contradicted every explanation she tried to provide. Modern technology makes it nearly impossible to have secret relationships when every transaction and location check-in creates permanent records that suspicious partners can easily access. The support system that had pushed my wife toward opening our marriage was crumbling faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. These women who had spent months telling her that she deserved more excitement and variety in her life were suddenly dealing with their own relationship disasters. The confident advisors became panicked clients seeking help from anyone who would listen to their problems. The most pathetic part was watching them abandon my wife when she needed support the most. When her affair collapsed and our marriage was falling apart, these friends suddenly became too busy with their own crises to offer the emotional support they had promised. The same women who had encouraged her to take risks and explore her options disappeared when those risks resulted in consequences that required actual friendship and loyalty. The group chat that had been full of encouragement and excitement about their various romantic adventures became a graveyard of unanswered messages and ignored requests for advice. Nobody wanted to be associated with the disaster they had collectively created. They were like financial advisors recommending risky investments and then refusing to take calls when the market crashed. My wife found herself completely isolated from the friend group that had convinced her to destroy her marriage. These women, who had made exploration and self-discovery sound so appealing, were now dealing with divorce proceedings, custody battles, and workplace harassment complaints. The Sisterhood of Relationship Rebels had turned into a collection of cautionary tales about the dangers of following bad advice from people who had never successfully navigated the challenges they were encouraging others to face. Jessica ended up moving back in with her parents after losing both her boyfriend and her job due to the workplace harassment situation with her manager. Lisa's husband filed for divorce and sought full custody of their children based on evidence of her infidelity and poor judgment. The other friends in the group faced similar consequences as their relationships collapsed under the weight of decisions that seemed exciting in theory, but proved devastating in practice. The toxic friend group that had seemed so supportive and progressive revealed itself to be nothing more than a collection of miserable people who wanted company in their bad decisions. They had convinced each other that their dissatisfaction with commitment and stability was actually wisdom about modern relationships. Instead of helping each other grow and find happiness, they had created an echo chamber that amplified their worst impulses and justified their most destructive choices. My wife was left to face the consequences of following advice from people who had proven incapable of maintaining their own relationships while encouraging others to sabotage theirs. With her support system in ruins and her workplace romance exposed as a fantasy,
the final showdown
when desperation meets reality. The last card she had left to play was attempting to use physical intimacy as some kind of reset button for our entire relationship. After months of being too tired or uninterested, she suddenly transformed into this seductive version of herself that felt completely artificial. She started initiating physical contact with this forced enthusiasm that made it obvious she was following some kind of relationship rescue manual she had found online. The woman who had been rejecting my advances for a year was now acting like we were newlyweds trying to conceive our first child. The timing was so transparent it was almost insulting. Right after her manager had revealed its true feelings and her friend group had abandoned her, she decided that sexual chemistry would somehow undo all the emotional damage she had caused. She approached intimacy like it was a negotiation tool rather than an expression of genuine desire. Every touch felt calculated and every kiss seemed rehearsed, like she was performing a role rather than connecting with someone she actually wanted to be with. Her question about what Sarah provided that she could not offer was like asking why people need oxygen to breathe. She genuinely could not understand what the difference was between someone who chose to be with me and someone who saw me as a convenient backup plan. She thought that physical availability was the same thing as emotional connection, and that competing for my attention was just a matter of trying harder in bed. The concept that respect and genuine affection might be more important than sexual performance was completely foreign to her. I refused her advances and tried to explain that if she still did not understand what Sarah offered that she never had, then our marriage was finished. The difference was not about physical technique or sexual creativity. Sarah wanted to spend time with me because she enjoyed my company, not because she needed something from me. She listened when I talked and remembered details about my life because she cared about what mattered to me. She made me feel valued as a person rather than useful as a provider. The comedy of watching her try to solve relationship problems with physical solutions was painful and hilarious at the same time. She had spent months emotionally withdrawing from our marriage while pursuing someone else and now thought that bedroom enthusiasm would magically repair the damage. She was trying to compete in a contest that had nothing to do with physical compatibility and everything to do with basic human decency and mutual respect. Her shock at my complete lack of interest revealed how little she understood about what had gone wrong between us. She had assumed that men were simple creatures who could be won back with sexual attention and romantic gestures. The idea that I might have developed genuine feelings for someone else who treated me better never occurred to her as a real possibility. She thought Sarah was just a temporary distraction that would fade once she decided to fight for our marriage. My emotional withdrawal was complete by this point. I watched her desperate attempts to reconnect with the same detachment I might observe a stranger having a breakdown on public transportation. The woman who had been the center of my world for 8 years had become someone whose problems no longer affected me emotionally. Her pain was real, but it was also the natural consequence of choices she had made while ignoring how those decisions would impact our relationship. I started preparing for divorce with the same methodical approach I used for any major life decision. I researched lawyers who specialized in cases involving infidelity and gathered financial documents that would be needed for asset division. I opened my own bank account and began separating our shared responsibilities. The practical steps toward ending our marriage felt more natural than trying to pretend we could rebuild what she had systematically destroyed. Her horror at discovering that actions have real consequences was fascinating to witness. She had convinced herself that exploration and personal growth were noble pursuits that justified any temporary damage to our relationship. The possibility that some mistakes could not be undone with apologies and promises to change had never seriously occurred to her. She thought love was supposed to be unconditional and forgiving regardless of how badly someone behaved. My consultation with a divorce attorney was the clearest signal that her brilliant plan had backfired completely. I spent 2 hours discussing the legal implications of adultery in our state and how our open marriage agreement might affect property division. The lawyer explained that emotional affairs followed by sanctioned relationships often created complicated situations in divorce proceedings, but that I had strong grounds for dissolution based on her deception about the timeline of her involvement with her manager. She followed me to the lawyer's office and waited in the parking lot like some kind of relationship stalker. When I came out, she begged me to reconsider and give her another chance to prove that she could be the wife I deserved. She promised to attend counseling, quit her job, move to a different city, or do whatever it took to save our marriage. Her desperation was genuine, but it was also about a year too late to matter. The tragedy of her situation was that she had gotten exactly what she thought she wanted, and discovered it was nothing like what she actually needed. She had pursued excitement and variety and found herself with a man who saw her as entertainment between meetings. She had sought adventure and personal growth and ended up isolated from everyone who had ever cared about her. Her perfect plan had given her temporary thrills in exchange for permanent damage to the one relationship that had provided stability and genuine affection. Watching her realize that she had traded something real for something imaginary was like watching someone discover they had sold a winning lottery ticket for pocket change. The manager who had seemed so fascinating and sophisticated turned out to be just another workplace player with a system for manipulating lonely married women. The friends who had encouraged her exploration abandoned her when their advice led to disaster. The husband who had been her reliable support system was planning a future with someone who actually wanted to be part of it. Her final breakdown was complete and devastating. She had lost the man she thought she wanted, destroyed the marriage she had taken for granted, and alienated the friends who had pushed her toward these decisions. She was left alone with the consequences of choices that had seemed so reasonable when she was convinced that having everything was possible. The woman who thought she was playing chess had discovered she was actually playing checkers, while everyone else moved on to a completely different game. Meanwhile, I was discovering what it felt like to be genuinely wanted by someone who had no ulterior motives for spending time with me. The new normal, living with the consequences of clever plans. 6 months later, the new normal had settled into place, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. My life with Sarah became everything I had forgotten a relationship could be. She would text me good morning messages that actually made me smile instead of feeling like obligations to respond to. When we made plans, she kept them and seemed genuinely excited about spending time together rather than treating our dates like items to check off a social calendar. The woman who had moved here from another country to build a new life was teaching me what it felt like to be someone's priority instead of their backup plan. The contrast between Sarah's enthusiasm about introducing me to her family and my wife's manager refusing to acknowledge her existence in public was almost too perfect. Sarah called her parents every weekend and would put me on the phone so they could practice their English while getting to know the man who was making their daughter happy. She talked about planning a trip so I could meet them in person and experience the culture she had grown up in. Meanwhile, my wife had spent months with someone who would not even hold her hand if other people might see them together. Sarah treated our relationship like something worth investing in rather than something to hide from the important people in her life. She introduced me to her coworkers as her boyfriend and invited me to company events where she would proudly show me off to anyone who would listen. She wanted to integrate me into every aspect of her world, while my wife had been content being someone's secret entertainment between business meetings. The role reversal from where this whole experiment started was comedy gold. I had become the person with weekend plans and social invitations while my wife sat at home dealing with the aftermath of her brilliant strategy. She would ask what I was doing for the evening, and I would tell her about dinner reservations or concert tickets or weekend trips that Sarah had planned for us. The woman who had been too busy with her dating life to notice my existence was now the one being left behind while I lived my best life with someone who actually wanted my company. Her scheme to have an affair without consequences had created consequences she never could have imagined when she was orchestrating the whole arrangement. She thought she was so clever finding a way to pursue her manager while keeping me as her reliable safety net. Instead, she ended up with neither the excitement she was chasing nor the security she had taken for granted. Her perfect plan gave her temporary thrills that cost her everything stable and meaningful in her life. Watching her resign from her job to avoid the daily humiliation of seeing her former affair partner was pathetic and hilarious at the same time. She could not handle being in the same building as someone who knew exactly how desperate she had been for his attention and how little she had meant to him. The workplace that had seemed so exciting when it contained her romantic fantasy became unbearable when she understood how foolish she had looked to everyone who witnessed her infatuation. Her social isolation became more obvious as weeks passed, and she realized how much of her recent social life had revolved around the friends who had encouraged her terrible decisions. These women had abandoned her when their advice led to disaster, and she was left with no support system beyond the husband she had systematically alienated. She went from having an active social calendar full of girls' nights and dating adventures to spending evenings alone wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The temporary thrills she had chased proved expensive when measured against the permanent damage to relationships that had provided actual stability and happiness. A few months of excitement with someone who never cared about her had cost her years of trust and affection from someone who had genuinely loved her. She learns the hard way that fleeting pleasure rarely justifies destroying something real and lasting that took years to build. Our marriage counseling sessions became exercises in futility as the therapist tried to help us navigate a situation where one person wanted to rebuild trust while the other had already moved on emotionally. My wife would talk about her regrets and her commitment to change while I sat there thinking about Sarah and wondering why I was wasting time trying to repair something that was broken beyond fixing. The therapy was supposed to help us reconnect, but mostly it highlighted how far apart we had grown. The uncertainty about our future created this strange dynamic where we were technically still married but living completely separate lives. She was desperately trying to win back someone who no longer wanted to be one, while I was building a relationship with someone who had never required winning over in the first place. We existed in the same house, but inhabited different emotional worlds that no longer intersected in meaningful ways. My feelings about her situation were complicated because I could see how much she was suffering while also recognizing that her pain was entirely self-inflicted. She had created this disaster through calculated decisions that prioritized short-term excitement over long-term stability. Part of me felt sorry for her because watching someone destroy their own life is inherently tragic. Another part of me felt like she was finally experiencing the natural consequences of treating people like disposable options rather than human beings with feelings. The compassion I felt for her suffering was balanced by my awareness that she had shown no similar consideration for my feelings when she was orchestrating her affair. She had been perfectly willing to risk our marriage for someone who turned out to be completely worthless. Now that our gamble had failed spectacularly, she expected empathy and support from the person she had been prepared to discard if her adventure had worked out differently. Sarah represented everything my wife had thrown away in pursuit of something that existed only in her imagination. While my wife was dealing with workplace embarrassment and social isolation, I was planning vacations with someone who saw our future together as something worth investing in. The woman who thought she was playing chess had actually been playing checkers while everyone else moved on to an entirely different game. Looking back at this entire situation, I could not help but wonder if some choices reveal so much about a person's character that forgiveness becomes impossible, regardless of how much they claim to have learned from their mistakes. The truth is that some people reveal who they really are when they think they can get away with anything. My wife's story proves that trying to have everything often means losing what actually matters. She wanted the security of marriage plus the excitement of an affair and ended up with neither. The best relationships are built on people who genuinely want to be together, not elaborate schemes to avoid honest conversations about what's missing. Her plan worked perfectly except for the part where it destroyed everything she actually needed. Here's the question that keeps me up at night. When someone orchestrates the destruction of their marriage through months of calculated deception, do they deserve forgiveness